Havana, 1946. The air is thick with cigar smoke, jazz and money. Inside the grand ballroom of the Hotel Nacional, a gathering unlike any other in criminal history unfolds. Men in immaculate white suits, their accents stretching from New York to Chicago to Sicily, raise glasses under chandeliers that sparkle like stolen diamonds. And at the center of it all sits a man who shouldn't even be there, a man the United States government had banished forever. His name, Charles Lucky Luciano. Once the king of America's underworld, Luciano had been deported to Italy after serving time for running the largest prostitution network in New York. To the outside world he was finished, exiled, humiliated, stripped of his empire. Yet here he is, thousands of miles from home, commanding the attention of the most dangerous men alive. His voice is calm, deliberate. He doesn't shout or threaten. He doesn't have to. Every man in the room knows that without him, the modern mafia would never have existed. The camera moves in close. We see his face, older now, his features carved by war, prison, and betrayal. The smirk that once disarmed politicians and killers alike has hardened into something else, a mask of endurance. Around him sit his old allies, Meyer Lansky, the financial genius, Frank Costello, the diplomat, and in the shadows, Vito Genovese, the schemer whose ambition burns hotter than loyalty. Together they are here to discuss the future of organized crime, narcotics, casinos, international expansion, all under Luciano's unseen hand. The irony is almost poetic. The United States had exiled Luciano to destroy his power, yet in exile he had found a new kind of authority, one untethered by borders. Havana, glittering under the Caribbean moon, becomes his new New York, a neutral ground where mobsters can meet, gamble and plan without the constant gaze of American law enforcement. In these halls, beneath the rhythm of rumba and the clink of whiskey glasses, history is being rewritten. But beneath the glamour, something darker hums. Luciano senses it, that thin wire of tension connecting every smile, every toast. Power is fragile. Respect can turn to rebellion in a single whispered word. He knows the men around him admire him, yes, but they also wait for him to slip. Age, distance, exile, these are poisons to a man who once controlled the streets block by block. Now his empire is an echo, his influence maintained not by force but by memory. As the meeting continues, Luciano lights a cigarette and looks toward the window. Outside, Havana glows, a city alive with corruption and opportunity. Yet for him it is also a prison. No matter how many soldiers or dollars he commands, he cannot set foot on American soil again. The country that made him now forbids his return. It's as if the very streets that once bent to his will have been sealed behind an invisible wall. He exhales smoke slowly, his mind drifting back to New York. Mulberry Street, the docks, the nights when he and his friends were nothing but street kids hustling to survive. He remembers the faces of those who helped him rise, and those he buried along the way. The price of power was always blood, but exile adds something new, emptiness. As the Havana band starts a slow, haunting tune, Luciano stands and raises his glass. To the future, he says simply. The men repeat it, to the future, though each one imagines a different version of it. For some, the future means money and freedom. For others, it means taking his place. The camera pulls back as the music swells. Around the room, laughter hides calculation, loyalty hides betrayal, and the ghost of the American Don stands at the center of it all, powerful yet powerless, revered yet alone. This is not the story of a rise to power. That part of Lucky Luciano's life has already been told. This is the story of what happens after the throne, when exile becomes a second prison, and a man who once ruled New York must face the silence of his own legend. From Havana's golden lights to the cold alleys of Naples, this is the final act of a king in exile, a story of illusion, legacy, and the long shadow of the American Mafia. It begins not with triumph, but with a ghost raising a glass to a future that's already slipping away. The year is 1946. The Second World War has ended, America is rebuilding, and the name Lucky Luciano has faded from the newspapers. But for Charles Luciano himself, the world has become very small. A few gray walls, a prison cell, and a life reduced to whispers and regrets. After nearly a decade behind bars, he receives word that changes everything. Governor Thomas Dewey, the same man who once built his career by putting him away, has agreed to commute his sentence. Freedom at last, but with a cruel price. Luciano will never again set foot on American soil. His release comes with deportation. To Italy, the land of his birth but not his home. The irony cuts deep. The boy who had left Sicily as a poor immigrant had built an empire in New York. Now, as an old man, he's sent back to the place he escaped from, like a king stripped of his crown and thrown into exile. As he steps off the ship in Naples, the Mediterranean sun glares down, harsh and unforgiving. There are reporters waiting, Italian police watching, and curious locals whispering his name. They've heard the stories, the American gangster, the boss of bosses. Some greet him like a returning celebrity, others like a contagion. But behind the tailored suit and slick hair, Luciano feels something he hasn't felt in years: fear. Not of death, he's lived with that all his life, but of irrelevance. Naples in 1946 is a city of ruins. The war has left its mark: bombed-out buildings, ration lines, children begging in the streets. The black market thrives in the chaos, but this is not the New York he knew. There are no gleaming nightclubs, no hidden speakeasies, no politicians to bribe with quiet envelopes. Here power looks different. It is crude, desperate, and unpredictable. Luciano tries to adjust. He rents a modest apartment, frequents cafes, and entertains visitors from the underworld. But his every move is watched. The Italian police, under pressure from both the Vatican and the Americans, treat him like a contagious disease, surveilled, restricted, never truly free. Every conversation he has is shadowed by suspicion. Every meeting is noted in a report. The king is out of his castle and the guards are everywhere. In letters to old associates in New York, Luciano writes of his frustration. He feels disconnected, helpless. The empire he once ruled, the commission, the 5 families, now moves on without him. Frank Costello holds the political reins, Meyer Lansky handles the finances, and new faces rise, men who only know Luciano as a legend, not a leader. The machine he built no longer needs its architect. He spends his nights staring out the window, listening to the distant hum of a city rebuilding itself. He thinks about the choices that brought him here, the deals, the betrayals, the murders ordered in whispers. In America he had been the godfather of order, turning chaos into business. Now in Italy he's just another exile surrounded by memories that no longer obey him. But power never truly dies, it adapts. Luciano begins to reconnect through the shadows. He reaches out to old Sicilian contacts, men who fought in the resistance, smugglers who run contraband through Naples' crumbling port. Slowly a new network begins to form. He starts to see possibilities: cigarettes, liquor, morphine, anything that can move through the ruins. He might have lost his empire but not his instincts. Still, the psychological toll grows heavier. For a man like Luciano, control was oxygen. Now, every letter is censored, every visitor questioned. Even the simple act of walking through Naples feels like walking through his own obituary. The locals look at him with awe and suspicion, half fascinated, half afraid. Some call him Il Americano, others whisper Lucania. A reminder that no matter how powerful he once was here, he's just another immigrant who left and came back too late. He misses the rhythm of New York, the pulse of the city that once moved to his will. He misses the smell of Manhattan after rain, the sound of cars honking on Mulberry Street, the coded conversations in smoke-filled rooms. But most of all, he misses belonging. In America he was a king among men. In Italy he's a foreigner in his own birthplace. Luciano spends long evenings walking along the Bay of Naples, the sea stretching endlessly before him. Somewhere beyond that horizon lies the country that made him, a land he'll never see again. The waves crash against the rocks and he imagines them whispering in the accents of the past, the voices of Lansky, Costello, Siegel, men still out there building futures he can no longer touch. Every exile must make a choice, to fade away or to rebuild from the ashes. Luciano is not the kind of man to fade. Beneath his calm exterior, a plan begins to form, a vision of rebirth, not in New York but somewhere new, somewhere untouchable. He hears whispers from Meyer Lansky about opportunities in Cuba, casinos, politics, and money waiting to be claimed under the Caribbean sun. For the first time since stepping off the deportation ship, Luciano feels the flicker of hope, or perhaps delusion. The king has fallen, yes, but the game isn't over. He will find a way to rule again even from exile. He's Lucky Luciano, and luck, as he always said, is just another word for control. As the camera lingers on his face, lined, wary, defiant, the narration closes in. They took his throne but not his hunger. They sent him into exile, but the exile would only make him more dangerous. The king had fallen, but kings in his world never stayed dead for long. The streets of Naples in the late 1940s are a paradox, beauty and ruin sharing the same breath. Beneath the Baroque architecture and the shimmering blue of the Mediterranean lies a city broken by war. Buildings stand like skeletons, walls pockmarked with bullet holes. Children play in alleys surrounded by rubble, and the smell of salt air mixes with diesel fumes and desperation. It is in this chaos that Lucky Luciano tries to reinvent himself. He walks through these streets in sharp suits that don't belong to this world. Tailored silk, polished shoes, the wardrobe of a king stranded in a kingdom of beggars. To the Neapolitans he is both alien and magnetic. They whisper when he passes, "That's him. The gangster from America. The man who knew Al Capone." Some approach him with awe, some with fear, and a few with opportunity in their eyes. Luciano rents a small apartment near Via Tasso, overlooking the bay. The furniture is modest, the curtains drawn. He keeps the blinds half open, not out of comfort but calculation. From here he can watch the comings and goings below, the market vendors, the soldiers, the black market runners. Even in exile he studies patterns, learns rhythms, and searches for leverage. It's instinct. The post-war black market in Naples is thriving, fueled by hunger and corruption. American GIs trade cigarettes, chocolate, and fuel for favors. Local smugglers move anything that can bring profit, from morphine to meat, from liquor to stolen uniforms. For most it's survival. For Luciano it's infrastructure. He begins quietly investing in these operations, using intermediaries and false names. A network starts to form, not unlike the one he built in New York decades earlier, smaller, rougher but familiar. He befriends figures from the city's underbelly, ex-fascist officers, dock workers, Sicilian traffickers, men who recognize authority when they see it. They come to his apartment late at night, seeking advice, money, or protection. He rarely raises his voice. Instead, he listens, nods, and gives direction in that calm, almost fatherly tone that once made senators tremble. Naples becomes his laboratory of power, an experiment in rebuilding influence without ever leaving the shadows. But it is not the same. In America he had built an empire out of vision and structure, turning chaos into hierarchy. Here everything feels temporary, unstable. The men he deals with are unpredictable, desperate rather than disciplined. They respect him, but they don't fear him the way his New York associates did. They don't understand his code, the unwritten laws of loyalty and silence that once defined the Mafia. At night he often sits by the window listening to the city hum below, the music, the laughter, the occasional gunshot. He lights a cigarette, his mind drifting to the past. He thinks of the old commission meetings, of Meyer Lansky's calm voice and Frank Costello's diplomacy. They're still in America, still pulling strings. And here he is, the architect of it all, trapped in a city that feels like a stage set after the audience has gone home. Still, Luciano adapts. He knows how to turn exile into opportunity. He starts meeting with American soldiers stationed nearby, small-time hustlers looking to make quick money. Through them he finds new channels for contraband, black market cigarettes, stolen army supplies, even penicillin. Slowly money begins to flow again. It's not the millions he once commanded, but its power, the kind that moves silently and invisibly. The Italian press begins to take notice. Rumors spread that Lucky Luciano is rebuilding his empire from Naples. The headlines call him Il Padrino degli Americani, the godfather of the Americans. The police tighten surveillance, following him to cafes and bars, noting every handshake and every face. But they can't prove anything. Luciano plays the part of the retired man, polite, distant, sometimes even charming with the officers who question him. He smiles as he denies every accusation. Behind the mask, though, something deeper brews: frustration. He sees the inefficiency, the greed, the lack of vision in the local criminal networks. These men chase quick money. They don't understand structure, balance, or politics. Luciano, ever the strategist, starts to dream again, not of Naples but of something bigger. A base of operations far enough from U.S. jurisdiction, yet close enough to influence the flow of American money. That dream takes shape in the whispers of Meyer Lansky's letters: Cuba. The perfect bridge between old and new worlds. A place where American tourists bring fortunes, where politicians sell favors, and where the sun never stops shining. To Luciano, Havana sounds like redemption, a place where he can be powerful again but this time, legally invisible. Yet Naples refuses to let him go easily. Italian authorities, under American pressure, tighten their grip. Every visitor is interrogated. Every phone call is tapped. Luciano can feel the noose tightening. The illusion of freedom begins to dissolve. For all his money and connections, he's still a prisoner. Only this time the bars are invisible and the guards wear suits. One evening, after a long dinner with a few loyal associates, Luciano steps out into the humid Neapolitan night. The city is alive. Music spilling from taverns, lovers whispering in doorways, smugglers loading trucks under the dim light of street lamps. He watches it all, this theater of survival, and a half-smile crosses his face. He understands it better than anyone. This chaos, this hunger, this instinct to survive, it's what made him who he is. And yet, he knows he doesn't belong here. Naples is his purgatory, not his kingdom. As the camera lingers on him walking alone along the waterfront, the narrator's voice softens. In America, Lucky Luciano built a world of order out of crime. In Italy, he found a world of crime without order. But even in exile, he would not stop searching for control. The world had changed, but so would he. And with that, the scene begins to fade, the neon of Havana shimmering faintly in the distance, a new empire calling the fallen king back into the light. To understand the strange, almost unholy alliance that would one day free Lucky Luciano from prison, we have to step back a few years, to the dark heart of World War II. The year is 1942 and America is at war on two fronts. German U-boats stalk the Atlantic, sinking supply ships bound for Europe. On the docks of New York Harbor, the lifeline of the American war effort, paranoia spreads like wildfire. Rumors circulate that Axis spies have infiltrated the longshoremen's unions, that saboteurs move among the crates and warehouses. The U.S. Navy, desperate and out of options, turns to an unlikely ally, organized crime. The connection begins quietly. A Navy intelligence officer, Charles Haffenden, meets with Albert Anastasia, a feared hitman and Luciano's old associate. Anastasia, sensing an opportunity, passes the message upward through Frank Costello, and finally to Luciano himself. The government wants something: control of the docks, intelligence on Sicily, and peace among the mob-controlled unions during wartime. In return there might be favors. Luciano, sitting in his Dannemora prison cell, listens to this proposal with quiet amusement. He, the enemy of the state, now being courted by that same state to protect its war effort, is almost poetic. He agrees without hesitation. Not because of patriotism, Lucky was never sentimental, but because he sees a rare opportunity to regain relevance. His empire may be gone, but his influence, even from behind bars, still commands fear and loyalty. From that moment on, a secret operation takes shape, one that history would later call Operation Underworld. Through Luciano's contacts, the docks of New York are suddenly efficient, silent, and secure. The strikes and slowdowns stop overnight. Rumors of German infiltration vanish. Even the Navy is impressed. And when the time comes for the Allied invasion of Sicily in 1943, Luciano's network once again proves invaluable. Through his old Sicilian contacts, men who had lived under Mussolini's fascist regime and knew every inch of the island, intelligence filters to the Allies. Safe landing zones, sympathetic local bosses, maps of German troop movements. The U.S. invasion of Sicily, Operation Husky, becomes one of the most successful amphibious campaigns of the war. To the public, it's a triumph of military precision. But in the shadows, Lucky Luciano's fingerprints are everywhere. For the American government, this unholy alliance is a necessary evil. For Luciano, it's salvation disguised as service. When victory comes, he expects gratitude and leverage. His lawyers file for commutation of his sentence, arguing that his wartime assistance had helped save American lives. The request lands on the desk of Governor Thomas Dewey, the same Dewey who had built his political fame by prosecuting Luciano a decade earlier. Dewey resists at first. To release Luciano would be political suicide. But the Navy quietly intervenes, submitting classified reports praising Luciano's cooperation. The pressure mounts. By 1946, Dewey relents, a political calculation wrapped in a moral compromise. Luciano's sentence is commuted, not erased. He's free to walk out of prison but not free to stay in America. When the announcement comes, the press is stunned. Headlines scream, Luciano freed, deported to Italy. Some call it justice, others treason. The Navy denies involvement, but insiders know the truth. America made a deal with the devil and now the devil is going home. For Luciano, the news is bittersweet. He steps out of Great Meadow Prison a thinner, older man. Gone is the swagger of the 1930s, replaced by the stillness of a strategist who has learned patience in confinement. Yet his eyes, sharp as ever, reveal the mind of someone already thinking 2 steps ahead. Exile may take him from America, but it will not take America from him. As he boards the ship to Italy under heavy guard, reporters shout questions. Lucky, will you stay out of trouble this time? Any regrets about leaving the U.S.? He smiles faintly and answers, America made me. That's something no one can deport. But behind that smile lies calculation. Luciano knows he owes America a debt, not of gratitude but of vengeance. They used him when they needed him, then discarded him when he became inconvenient. His release was not a gift, it was containment. The government thought exile would bury his power. Instead, it becomes the beginning of something far more dangerous, a rebirth outside their reach. In Naples, as he steps onto Italian soil, the irony gnaws at him. The same country he helped liberate from fascism now watches him like a criminal. The Americans, who once relied on his underworld discipline, now treat him like a plague they must keep overseas. And yet, deep down, Luciano feels something close to pride. In his own twisted way, he had served his country, the only way he knew how. Still, he understands the game. The U.S. government might have ended his official reign, but unofficially they had reaffirmed his legend. Lucky Luciano, the man too useful to kill, too dangerous to keep. It's a title he'll wear with satisfaction. As the ship carrying him to exile disappears over the Atlantic, the narrator's voice cuts through the hum of the sea. He had saved America's docks, helped liberate Sicily, and secured his own freedom, but at a cost. The government thought they'd ended his story. In truth, they'd given him a new beginning. For a man like Lucky Luciano, exile wasn't punishment. It was promotion, to a global stage. And somewhere, in the back of his mind, a plan begins to form. A plan that will take him to Havana, where the ghosts of America's underworld will rise again under the Caribbean sun. By the late 1940s, exile had become both cage and crucible for Lucky Luciano. Italy was suffocating him. Too many eyes, too much history, too little opportunity. Naples was a place for ghosts, not empire builders. But across the sea, beyond the Atlantic, a new horizon shimmered like a mirage. Havana, Cuba. Cuba in the post-war years was a fever dream, a paradise dressed in corruption. American tourists flooded its casinos, politicians sold favors as casually as drinks, and Havana pulsed with jazz, rum, and money. It was the jewel of the Caribbean, and the perfect place for a man who had been exiled from America but not from power. The idea first reached Luciano through his old partner, Meyer Lansky, the brains behind the Mafia's financial empire. Lansky saw what Cuba could be, a neutral ground for organized crime, safe from the FBI and overflowing with American dollars. Luciano, restless in Naples and desperate for purpose, saw it as destiny. If he couldn't return to New York, he would make his own New York, in Havana. But getting there was no simple matter. Luciano was under constant surveillance by Italian and American authorities. Officially, he was banned from entering the Western Hemisphere. Unofficially, his allies were already greasing palms in Havana and beyond. Through a labyrinth of bribes, fake passports, and sympathetic officials, the plan took shape. By 1946, Lucky Luciano slipped quietly out of Italy and landed in Cuba, a man reborn. The moment his feet touched Cuban soil, it was as if he had stepped into a dream painted in gold and smoke. Havana was alive in ways Naples could never be. Neon signs flickered across the Malecon, orchestras played in open-air clubs, and gamblers threw fortunes onto green tables under the glow of chandeliers. For Luciano, it was like stepping back into the 1930s, the world he had built and lost, resurrected under the Caribbean sun. He took up residence at the luxurious Hotel Nacional, a palace of marble floors and velvet curtains overlooking the sea. From his suite, he could see ships docking from Miami and New York, bringing not just tourists but envelopes, allies, and messages from his past life. For the first time since exile, he felt powerful again. Cuba's dictator, Fulgencio Batista, was a man who understood money. Lansky had already cultivated his friendship, ensuring that the island's casinos and hotels operated under mob influence with government protection. Batista's regime offered exactly what Luciano craved: freedom from law and the illusion of legitimacy. Within months, Luciano began moving quietly through Havana's underworld, reuniting with his old allies, Lansky, Frank Costello, Joe Adonis, and others. Plans formed over cigars and whiskey, the expansion of the gambling empire, the distribution of narcotics through Caribbean routes, the laundering of profits through legitimate fronts. But Havana was more than business. It was theater, a show of resurrection. Luciano made sure the right people saw him: journalists, nightclub owners, local bosses. His mere presence sent a message across the criminal world: the Don was back. For the younger generation of mobsters who had only heard his name in legend, seeing him alive, confident, and commanding was electrifying. Yet beneath the glamour, the clock was already ticking. His arrival had not gone unnoticed. The American embassy in Havana began sending reports back to Washington. Charles Luciano, deported criminal, believed to be residing in Cuba under false documents. Pressure mounted on the Batista government to expel him. But for now the money was too good and the parties too bright. Luciano spent his days in meetings and his nights at the casino tables, surrounded by the hum of big band music and the scent of expensive cigars. He had always been a strategist, but now he was also a philosopher of power. In private conversations he spoke about the future of organized crime, about turning it from chaos into industry. "The days of gang wars are over," he told one associate. "Now we deal in systems. No more bullets. Just balance sheets." Still, not everything could be controlled. The undercurrent of tension ran deep. Vito Genovese, the ambitious rival who had returned to America after the war, saw Luciano's revival as a threat. Even from afar, Luciano could feel his old rival's shadow stretching toward him. Whispers of betrayal, rumors of shifting loyalties within the New York families. But for now Luciano savored the illusion. Havana glowed, the music never stopped, and the island seemed suspended between sin and paradise. The Hotel Nacional became his unofficial headquarters, a gathering place for gangsters, gamblers, and dreamers. To outsiders, it was just another luxurious resort. To insiders, it was the beating heart of a global criminal network, a new commission rising under the palm trees. Every night, as he stood on the hotel balcony, the city spread before him like an empire reborn. The sea shimmered under the moonlight, and he could almost imagine New York's skyline on the horizon. The air was warm, heavy with the scent of tobacco and the promise of immortality. But deep inside Luciano knew the truth. Exile had changed him. The years in prison, the betrayal by his country, the long isolation in Naples, they had left cracks in his armor. The charm was still there, the intelligence undimmed, but the hunger carried something darker now. Power no longer thrilled him, it haunted him. He was building not just an empire, but a monument to what he had lost. A last great performance to prove that Lucky Luciano was still the architect of the underworld. Havana wasn't just business, it was redemption disguised as empire. As the camera drifts across the Havana skyline, the casinos glowing like embers against the night, the narrator's voice cuts in, slow and haunting. For Lucky Luciano, Havana was more than a refuge. It was a stage, a dream, a second chance to rewrite history. But in the world of crime, every dream has a price, and the higher you rise, the closer you come to the fall. The music swells and the screen fades to black, the next act waiting in the shadows. The summit that would bring every king, every boss, every rival to Luciano's doorstep, and begin the unraveling of the dream. December 1946. The air in Havana carries a heavy sweetness, tobacco smoke, rum, and danger. Inside the grand halls of the Hotel Nacional, the most powerful criminals in America have gathered under the Caribbean moon. Limousines glide through the palm-lined driveway, their headlights cutting through the warm night. Guards whisper in Sicilian, English, and Yiddish. Reporters are kept far from the gates. Something historic is about to happen, something the world will not learn about for decades. Lucky Luciano stands by the balcony overlooking the sea, cigarette in hand, his reflection caught in the glass. Behind him, the room fills with legends. Frank Costello, the quiet diplomat of the underworld, Albert Anastasia, the executioner with ice in his veins, Joe Adonis, suave and dangerous, and Meyer Lansky, calm as ever, the strategist who helped orchestrate this entire event. From Chicago comes Tony Accardo, representing the outfit in Al Capone's absence. From the West Coast, Frank Sinatra's rumored associates mingle with Cuban officials. And somewhere in the shadows, watching and waiting, is Vito Genovese, the snake in the garden. This is the Havana Conference, the first true global summit of organized crime. Its purpose, to decide the future of the mafia, its leadership, and its money. The commission in New York had fractured under Luciano's absence. Now with him back, if only unofficially, it's time to restore order. But Havana is not just a meeting. It's a coronation. Luciano wants to reclaim what was once his. Recognition as the boss of bosses, the architect of everything. As the doors close and the room grows quiet, Lansky begins the introductions. He outlines the agenda: narcotics distribution, casino investments, political partnerships, and the laundering of profits through Cuban and American banks. Each item is met with nods, murmurs, and careful calculations. This is not the old mafia of guns and street corners. This is the boardroom of a global corporation. The language of power has changed, and Luciano speaks it fluently. He addresses the room, his voice steady, his presence commanding. "We built something bigger than any one of us," he says. "Now we protect it. No more street wars. No more noise. We move like businessmen, quiet and rich. The men applaud. For a moment, it feels like the 1930s again, the empire reborn. But beneath the surface the tensions are real. Vito Genovese, seated near the back, watches every word. To him, Luciano is an aging relic. A man clinging to a throne he can no longer hold. Genovese whispers to his neighbor, spreading subtle poison. He tells anyone who will listen that Luciano's time is over, that a leader in exile cannot control New York streets. Meanwhile, Meyer Lansky works the edges, smoothing egos, keeping the peace. He knows the conference must appear united. Investors, politicians, and even the Batista government are watching. The casinos and hotels they plan to build will require not just cooperation but silence. One public scandal could destroy everything. As the days pass, deals are struck in the casino lounges and private suites. Luciano's men secure shares in Havana's biggest gambling operations, the Tropicana, the Riviera, the Nacional itself. The mob's money begins to flow through Cuba like a hidden river, clean and untraceable. The dream of a Caribbean empire seems real. Yet, the undercurrent of betrayal grows stronger. Late one night, Luciano meets privately with Genovese in a dimly lit suite. The air between them is heavy, thick with history. Genovese, ever the actor, bows slightly, feigning respect. "Charlie," he says softly, "you've done good. But you can't run things from here. The men in New York, they need someone who can be there." Luciano studies him, smoke curling from his cigarette. "Vito," he replies evenly, "when I want your advice I'll send for it." The silence that follows is colder than any threat. Genovese smiles, a thin reptilian smile, and excuses himself. The lines of war have been drawn even if no one speaks of it yet. The following evening a party fills the hotel ballroom. The music of Desi Arnaz and his orchestra fills the air. Champagne flows and dancers twirl under chandeliers. To the outside world it looks like celebration. To those in the know it's ceremony, the final public appearance of a king in full control. Luciano moves through the crowd like a ghost of his former self, elegant, charming, untouchable. The younger mobsters, those who grew up hearing stories of his empire, approach him with reverence. They call him Don Luciano, shake his hand and promise loyalty. For them he's more than a man, he's a myth made flesh. But in the shadows, Genovese whispers to allies, plotting the slow, silent coup that will bring Luciano down for good. He doesn't need to kill him, all he needs is to make him irrelevant. As the Havana night deepens, Luciano steps out to the balcony once more. The lights of the city stretch across the bay, flickering like embers. He can hear the laughter from inside, the music, the echoes of power reborn. But he also hears something else, the faint, familiar rhythm of betrayal. It's always there, somewhere behind the applause. He lifts his glass, looking toward the dark water. Havana has given him back his legend, but legends, he knows, are fragile things. They burn bright then vanish. The narrator's voice cuts through the music, calm and foreboding. In Havana, Lucky Luciano gathered his empire one last time. He believed he was building the future. But in truth he was sealing his fate. The summit that crowned him king would also plant the seeds of his downfall, and from that night forward, every ally he had would become a suspect, every smile a test of loyalty. The camera fades from the glitter of the ballroom to the empty streets outside, where the waves crash endlessly against the shore. The conference would end in triumph, but Havana, like every paradise, was built on borrowed time. The Havana dream did not last. By early 1947, whispers began to circulate, not just among gangsters but among diplomats and agents. The Americans had learned that Lucky Luciano, the man they had deported in triumph, was once again at the center of a criminal empire, this time operating from just 90 miles off their coast. To the U.S. government, it was an embarrassment. To Luciano it was déjà vu. He had escaped exile only to find himself back in the crosshairs of the same enemy he tried to outmaneuver all his life, the American state. The reports started small, consulate dispatches from Havana noting Luciano's presence at the Hotel Nacional, sightings at casino openings, whispers of his meetings with American mob figures. Within months, the FBI and the U.S. Narcotics Bureau had compiled dossiers, each page thick with paranoia and proof. Washington began to pressure Batista's government, deport Luciano or face diplomatic consequences. In Havana, Lucky could feel the walls tightening. He had bribed ministers, entertained generals, and even donated to local charities, trying to appear as nothing more than a businessman. But no amount of influence could fight the shadow of his own name. Once the myth of Luciano reappeared, the myth began to consume him. And behind the political pressure he suspected something darker. Vito Genovese. The man he'd once exiled to Italy had returned to America with quiet vengeance, whispering to law enforcement, stirring rumors, feeding stories to journalists through intermediaries. Genovese's hatred was not theatrical, it was surgical. He didn't want to kill Luciano's body, he wanted to erase his power piece by piece. The irony wasn't lost on Luciano. The same invisible war he had once waged against his own mentors, he now faced from the next generation. Every empire, he realized, eventually devours its creator. Meanwhile, his once untouchable base in Havana began to fracture. Batista, under U.S. pressure, started to distance himself. The Cuban press, bribed but restless, began hinting at foreign criminal influences. And within Luciano's circle, paranoia spread like smoke. Frank Costello, his old ally in New York, sent discreet warnings. The feds were watching his every move. Lansky, calm as ever, urged Luciano to keep a low profile, to stay out of sight until the storm passed. But that wasn't in Lucky's nature. He was a man of presence, not absence. Power, to him, was something you had to be seen holding, or it vanished. Then came the summons. A knock on his suite door at the Nacional. Two Cuban officials, polite but firm, informing him that the government had decided to revoke his residence permit. Batista had no choice, they said. The Americans were threatening to cut off aid. Luciano was to leave Cuba immediately. It was exile within exile. He had gambled everything on Havana, money, influence, identity, and lost it in a single decree. The news broke his composure only for a moment. Then, like the old general he was, he began to plan his retreat. Luciano boarded a freighter bound for Italy under quiet escort. Reporters managed to snap a few photographs. The once golden crime king, older now, hat pulled low, face unreadable. The man who had ruled New York's underworld, who had gathered the world's gangsters in Havana, was now being escorted off the island like an unwanted guest. But if the Americans thought this would end him, they underestimated his reach. From Naples, Luciano continued to pull strings, not directly but through layers of men who still owed him loyalty. Havana might have been closed, but the drug routes through the Mediterranean and Marseille were just beginning to open. The Mafia was global now, its veins spreading from Cuba to Sicily to New York, and Luciano had been its architect. Still, the political pressure left its mark. Italy's police, under American influence, began constant surveillance. Luciano couldn't walk through Naples without being followed. His phone lines were tapped. His mail was opened. Every meeting, every visitor was recorded. He lived in a beautiful apartment overlooking the Bay of Naples, but it felt like a prison cell with better scenery. To the public he was a relic, the American gangster in exile. But within the criminal world he was something else, a ghost who still cast a shadow. The shadow war between Luciano and Genovese intensified. Genovese, back in the United States, maneuvered to seize full control of the New York families. He presented himself as the future, the American-born successor to the old Sicilian order. Luciano, powerless to intervene directly, used intermediaries like Costello and Lansky to counterbalance Genovese's rise. It became a chess game played across oceans. One fought not with bullets but with alliances, betrayals, and whispers. Letters from New York painted a grim picture. Genovese was expanding, Costello's influence waning, and law enforcement was cracking down harder than ever. Luciano's exile, once a personal punishment, had become a strategic weapon against him. From Italy he watched his empire dissolve, not in flames but in silence. And yet he couldn't let go. Power had become his religion. Even from exile he gave orders, held meetings, advised, plotted. He could not imagine a world in which he wasn't part of the story. But the stress of the shadow war began to show. He suffered insomnia, headaches, bursts of paranoia. Friends noticed that he drank more, spoke less. Sometimes, staring out at the Mediterranean, he would mutter to himself, "They think I'm finished. Nobody finishes Lucky." The camera pans over the blue waters outside Naples, waves crashing against the rocky coast. The narrator's voice cuts in low and haunting. For a man who had ruled through order, Luciano's world was now ruled by ghosts, invisible enemies, political games, and the slow, suffocating truth that exile was the cruelest punishment of all. Havana had been his last empire. Now he ruled only from memory. The screen fades to black, and from the silence, the faint echo of a ticking clock. Because in exile, time itself had become Luciano's last rival. Naples, 1948. The streets hum with life, vendors shouting, scooters whining, children chasing stray dogs through the narrow alleys. But inside a quiet apartment overlooking the Bay of Naples, a man sits alone, staring out at the sea. His name is Charles Lucky Luciano, though few dare to say it aloud anymore. Once the king of New York, the architect of the American Mafia, he now lives like a ghost, surrounded by luxury, haunted by memory. From his balcony he can see the ships coming and going, freighters bound for Marseille, Genoa, and New York. He studies them like old friends and old enemies both, knowing that somewhere in their cargo holds lie the arteries of his invisible empire. Luciano may have been exiled, but his reach still pulses through the underworld's veins. The Havana chapter had ended, but the network he built did not die. Through intermediaries, Sicilian bosses, Corsican traffickers, and his American allies, Luciano began cultivating a new kind of empire. One without borders, built on the most lucrative commodity of the post-war world, heroin. The Second World War had left Europe broken but open. Ports were corrupt, borders weak, and black markets thriving. Luciano, ever the strategist, recognized the opportunity. The Marseille docks became the new frontier. There, Corsican syndicates, veterans of the French resistance turned smugglers, controlled shipping routes, while Sicilian families managed distribution. The product flowed from Turkey to France, from France to the United States. And though Luciano never handled the drugs himself, everyone knew the invisible hand behind the operation. He didn't need to be in New York to rule. He just needed to whisper. A coded letter to an old associate in Palermo. A message passed through a visiting businessman. A brief meeting at a Naples cafe with a man from Marseille. He orchestrated a criminal symphony with quiet precision. His exile, paradoxically, had made him more untouchable than ever. But the more he tried to regain control, the more the world slipped away from him. The mafia he had once designed, disciplined, balanced, corporate, was evolving into something darker. The new generation of bosses, born in the chaos of the war years, didn't believe in restraint. They were louder, greedier, more violent. They didn't understand the code that had built the empire, they only saw the money. Luciano began to feel like a father watching his children ruin the house he built. His letters to Castello and Lansky carried warnings: keep things clean, avoid attention, stay away from the dope. But even his oldest allies were losing control. Heroin was too profitable to resist, and too destructive to contain. Meanwhile, the Italian authorities, under U.S. pressure, turned Luciano's life into a public surveillance campaign. They followed him everywhere: restaurants, cinemas, even church. Every visitor was logged, every phone call recorded. Local newspapers, fed by American intelligence leaks, painted him as a villain reborn, the spider in a global web of narcotics. He denied it all. "I'm finished with that life," he told journalists. "I'm a businessman now. I sell olive oil." The line became almost tragic in its absurdity. Everyone knew the truth, that he was both retired and ruling, powerless yet powerful. The duality of Luciano's exile was almost poetic. He had become the ghost of the very system he created. And ghosts, as history shows, rarely rest easy. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, the world around him began to shift. The Cold War hardened borders. Law enforcement grew more sophisticated. American intelligence agencies, newly born and hungry for control, started linking organized crime with national security threats. The days of bribing a few cops were over. Luciano's world, built on secrecy and silence, was now drowning in a sea of documentation. But he still found ways to adapt. Through his Sicilian connections, he helped foster relationships between Italian and American underworld figures, ensuring that smuggling routes remained efficient. He turned exile into a kind of operational base, a place where he could host meetings under the guise of family visits. Naples became the quiet nerve center of a global criminal trade. Yet, for all the activity, something had shifted within him. He no longer felt the same thrill and control. His body was aging, his health failing. Decades of stress, imprisonment, and paranoia had taken their toll. The migraines came more often. His blood pressure spiked. Some nights, he would wake drenched in sweat, convinced the police were at his door. Other nights, he would pace for hours, staring at the ocean, reliving the Havana nights that had made him feel alive. The loneliness was worst of all. He had women, of course, loyal companions, fleeting loves, but none could fill the silence that haunted him. His old allies were dying or fading into retirement. Lansky had turned to legitimate business ventures in Florida. Costello was under pressure in New York. And Genovese, his old enemy, was finally consolidating power, using Luciano's exile as proof that the old order was gone. From Naples, Luciano watched it all, powerless to intervene, trapped in the echo of his own legend. He once controlled the future, now he was a relic of the past. Still he refused to vanish completely. When younger mobsters came to visit, he played the part of the mentor. He would tell stories about the old days, about discipline, about respect. "A boss doesn't need to shout," he would say, tapping his chest. "If they fear you in silence, you've already won." They listened, half in awe, half in disbelief. To them, Luciano was a living myth, a man from another time, the ghost of the Golden Age. As the camera pans over Naples at dusk, Luciano's figure stands silhouetted against the orange glow of the setting sun. The narrator's voice cuts through the wind. He had built the mafia to last forever. But empires, even those born in darkness, are not immune to decay. The world was changing and the old codes were dying with him. In exile, Lucky Luciano became what every king eventually becomes, a ghost haunting the empire he could no longer command. The music fades, low, melancholic strings, as the scene transitions to the next phase of his life, the unexpected return of power, and the betrayal that would finally end the myth. By the early 1950s, Lucky Luciano was living in a paradox, both free and imprisoned, powerful and irrelevant. From his apartment in Naples, he could look out over the shimmering bay and see the ships moving like slow ghosts across the horizon. They reminded him of everything he'd built, the invisible routes of power, money and loyalty that once connected continents. But now those same ships carried whispers, not tribute. His empire was running without him. Across the Atlantic, the landscape of organized crime was shifting, violently, quietly and permanently. The young lions had taken over. Vito Genovese, cunning and patient, was consolidating power in New York. Frank Costello, Luciano's old ally, was aging and tired, his grip loosening under pressure. Meyer Lansky was still loyal, but his focus had turned to legitimate investments. The world Luciano once ruled with iron discipline was now splintering into factions, ambition replacing order, greed replacing code. Luciano tried to stay involved. Letters went out under false names, visitors arrived under cover of family business. He still thought in terms of the old commission, the old structure, balance, respect, hierarchy. But that world was disappearing, and the men replacing it no longer believed in the idea of order. They believed in dominance. And in that new world, Luciano's voice carried the weight of nostalgia, not authority. Then the law came for him again, not with handcuffs this time but with headlines. In 1951 U.S. narcotics agencies launched an aggressive campaign against international drug smuggling. They traced shipments from Turkey through Marseille and into the American ports. The French connection had begun. And buried deep within those investigations, Luciano's name resurfaced. Whispered, alleged, never proven but always present. To the authorities, it didn't matter whether he was guilty or not. Luciano was a symbol, the ghost behind the global heroin trade. To the press, he was still Lucky Luciano, the puppet master of crime. His image filled newspapers again, the once dashing gangster now an aging exile with cold eyes and a faint smirk. The Italian government, already under U.S. pressure, responded with harassment disguised as law. Luciano's apartment was raided repeatedly. His bank accounts were frozen. Every visitor was interrogated. They found nothing concrete, but that didn't matter. The goal was to humiliate him, to remind him that no matter how far he ran, America's shadow would follow. To the world it looked like justice. To Luciano it felt like betrayal, not just by governments but by his own creation. The mafia had turned its back on him. He once said to a friend, "In America I built an empire. In Italy I'm just another prisoner." His exile, once filled with pride and quiet rebellion, had curdled into despair. The walls of his luxury apartment became the bars of an invisible cage. His health was deteriorating, high blood pressure, insomnia, heart trouble. He was only in his mid-50s, but the years had carved deep lines across his face. Still, when journalists managed to catch him outside, he would smile and say, "I'm retired. I'm clean. The old days are gone." But no one believed him, not even himself. And then came the ultimate betrayal, one that cut deeper than any rival's bullet. Vito Genovese, the man he had once spared and exiled, now ruled New York in Luciano's place. Through manipulation and intimidation, Genovese forced Costello to step down, consolidated the families and crowned himself as the new king. The newspapers called him the boss of bosses, the same title once reserved for Luciano. When the news reached Naples, Luciano read it in silence. No anger, no outburst, just a long, quiet stare at the paper before folding it neatly and setting it aside. "The title doesn't matter," he said later to an associate. "They can wear the crown. But they'll never understand how it was built." Still it hurt. Every part of him, the strategist, the builder, the survivor, burned with the realization that the world he'd created had forgotten him. To fill the void, he turned to routine. Every morning, he'd walk the same path through Naples, down the Via Caracciolo, past the cafes, nodding to locals who knew him only as the American. He'd sit at a small table overlooking the harbor, order an espresso and read the newspaper. It was a ritual of control in a life where he controlled nothing. He began keeping journals too, small notebooks filled with reflections, regrets, sketches of plans that would never be executed. He wrote about power as though it were a living thing, something that grows, breathes, and eventually turns on its master. "You never own power," one line reads. "You borrow it. And when it's done with you, it takes everything back." Those who visited him during this period described two Lucianos: the charming raconteur who could still command a room with a story, and the haunted old man who stared into the distance as if waiting for someone who would never return. But power, even in its dying form, has gravity. And soon, it began to draw him back into orbit. By the mid-1950s, rumors spread that Luciano was considering a deal with filmmakers to tell his story, a sanitized version of his rise and fall, meant to preserve his legacy. Others said he was cooperating with American authorities, trying to clear his name once and for all. Neither story was entirely true, but both contained a hint of something real. Luciano was tired of being remembered as a villain. He wanted control of his own narrative. In his mind, he had always been more than a gangster. He saw himself as a reformer, the man who brought logic to chaos, who turned the mafia from a street gang into a corporation. He wanted history to see him that way, not as the monster America painted. But redemption is a luxury few criminals ever get to write for themselves. The camera fades to a close-up. Luciano standing by the window looking out at the sea as the light fades. His reflection merges with the glass, half man, half ghost. The narrator's voice cuts through, quiet and solemn. The king who once ruled the underworld had outlived his throne. The world had moved on, and the man who taught it how to organize its crimes was now alone, a relic haunted by his own creation. But fate wasn't done with Lucky Luciano yet. In the twilight of his exile, one final act remained, and it would come not from vengeance, but from irony. The scene fades to black, the echo of footsteps on marble, and the whisper of a name that the world would soon hear again. By 1957, the world had changed almost beyond recognition, but Lucky Luciano remained, a survivor from another age, the last living architect of a vanished empire. Naples had grown quieter around him, its war wounds fading, its people moving on. But for Luciano, time had not healed, it had only sharpened the edges of memory. He was older now, slower, his body betraying him more each day, but his mind was still the same, analytical, restless, and defiant. The newspapers called him a relic. The police called him a threat. The underworld called him a legend. But to Luciano himself, none of it felt real anymore. "I'm tired of being a ghost," he told a close friend one night over dinner. "Everywhere I go, people see Lucky Luciano. But I don't know who that is anymore." He had lived a life in exile for more than a decade, moving through a fog of nostalgia, politics, and paranoia. Yet even in decline, Luciano never stopped strategizing. The instinct to control, to plan, to manipulate, it was part of his blood. And so, when a new opportunity appeared, he saw it not just as business, but as destiny. In late 1957, word reached him that a group of Italian-American filmmakers were developing a movie about his life. It was supposed to be a semi-fictionalized story, glamorous, dangerous, romantic, the rise of a poor Sicilian boy who became a king. Luciano was intrigued. He saw it as his last chance to rewrite the myth that had consumed him, to show the world the real story, not the government's propaganda or the tabloid's caricature. He wanted to control how history remembered him. But behind the cinematic proposal, there were rumors of something deeper, an arrangement with the American government. Some believed Luciano had agreed to cooperate quietly, providing information on the international narcotics trade in exchange for the easing of his surveillance and a possible partial pardon. Others claimed it was the opposite, that he was luring officials into a meeting to expose them, to prove that his exile had been built on lies. The truth, like much of Luciano's life, remains tangled in secrecy. What is certain is this: in early January 1962, Lucky Luciano began making arrangements for an important meeting. The location, the Naples International Airport. The visitor, an Italian film producer named Martin Gosch. who claimed to be finalizing the details for a movie about Luciano's life. For weeks, Luciano had prepared meticulously. He dressed sharply that morning, tailored gray suit, silk tie, hat tilted just right. The old gangster pride never left him, even when his hands trembled slightly as he buttoned his coat. Friends said he seemed nervous that day but not afraid. "This could change everything," he said before leaving. "Maybe it's time they heard my side." The drive to the airport was quiet. The city passed by in muted colors, the same streets he had walked for years, the same sea glinting under the winter sun. It was just another meeting, he told himself. Just another negotiation. But something about it felt different, heavier, as if the past itself were waiting for him at the other end of the runway. At approximately 5:30 p.m., Luciano arrived at Naples airport. Witnesses later said he was calm, composed, even smiling. He greeted Martin Gosch warmly, shook hands, exchanged pleasantries. The two men stepped aside to talk privately. For a moment, it seemed like just another business discussion, two professionals planning a project. Then suddenly Luciano's body stiffened. His face went pale. Without a word, he staggered backward, clutching his chest. Witnesses described it as if the world paused. Luciano tried to speak. Some said he whispered, "Tell them. I did it my way." Others heard nothing but a gasp. He collapsed onto the pavement as airport staff rushed to his side. By the time an ambulance arrived, Lucky Luciano, the man who had survived assassination attempts, prison sentences, deportation, and decades of betrayal, was dead. A heart attack, the doctor said. Instant. Final. News of his death spread quickly. To some, it was poetic justice. To others, it was a tragedy, the final fall of a man who had once held the underworld in his hands. In Naples, crowds gathered outside the morgue. Some came to mourn, others came to see the legend with their own eyes. Even the police, hardened by years of surveillance and suspicion, stood silently as his body was carried away. In the days that followed, speculation filled the newspapers. Was it really a heart attack? Had someone poisoned him? Was the meeting with the film producer a setup, a front for something darker? No one ever proved anything. But the myth grew larger with every retelling. Even in death, Lucky Luciano refused to be ordinary. The irony was almost cinematic. He had spent his life controlling every narrative, every story, every alliance, every deal, and in the end he couldn't control his own ending. Death had written the final script. In a small church in Naples, under gray winter skies, a private funeral was held. A few old associates attended quietly. No fanfare, no ceremony, just the faint echo of a priest's Latin prayers and the sound of waves beyond the stone walls. He was buried temporarily in Italy, but his will requested that his body be returned to America, to the country that had made him and destroyed him in equal measure. A few months later, his remains were flown to New York. As the plane touched down, the headlines read, "Lucky Luciano returns home for the last time." His casket was buried in St. John's Cemetery, Queens, not far from the graves of the very men who had once been his rivals and brothers. The man who had built the commission, who had reshaped organized crime from chaos into structure, had finally come full circle, from New York to Naples, from Havana to hell, and finally back home to the city that had made him immortal. The camera lingers on the marble headstone, Charles Lucky Luciano, 1897 to 1962. Then the narrator's voice, low and measured. He died not in a shootout or a courtroom but in silence, the same silence that had ruled his life. Some say his heart gave out. Others say it was the weight of everything he carried, the betrayals, the power, the ghosts. In the end, Lucky Luciano's empire outlived him, but his soul never escaped it. He was a king who built his own kingdom, then became its prisoner. And when he finally broke free, it wasn't through power, but through death. As the camera pans out over the cemetery, the city skyline fades into the horizon, a ghost of New York's lights shimmering in the distance. The legend of Lucky Luciano ends where it began, in the shadow between glory and guilt. Lucky Luciano's death in 1962 did not mark the end of his influence. In fact, it cemented it. From the streets of New York to the gambling dens of Havana, from Naples to the docks of Marseille, his fingerprints were everywhere. He had transformed organized crime into a structured, almost corporate entity, a network so intricate that even decades after his passing, authorities and criminals alike struggled to untangle its web. Luciano's genius lay not in brute force but in systems. Before him, the mafia was fractured, chaotic, a collection of rival gangs vying for control through violence and intimidation. He introduced hierarchy, rules, and the idea of the commission, a council of bosses designed to mediate disputes and allocate territories. Power became a calculated game, loyalty a currency. Murder was no longer the primary tool of leadership. Negotiation, persuasion, and strategic alliances were. He had codified crime. The ripple effects of Luciano's work spread globally. The commission model was adopted not just in New York, but in Chicago, Philadelphia, and across the Atlantic in Italy. Crime families that once operated independently now coordinated through rules, agreements, and hierarchies, a legacy that reshaped organized crime for generations. His influence extended beyond structure to finance. Luciano recognized that crime was most profitable when it was invisible. Gambling, narcotics, and smuggling operations became multinational enterprises. He pioneered the idea of using legitimate businesses to launder illicit gains, ensuring that his empire could survive scrutiny while generating immense wealth. Meyer Lansky, his longtime partner, perfected these techniques in Havana and Florida, but the blueprint had always been Luciano's. Culturally, Luciano became the archetype of the modern mobster. His life story, from poor Sicilian immigrant to New York's kingpin, inspired books, films, and later television series. He was the man who bridged the romanticized gangster of the 1920s and 1930s with the cold, calculating criminal empire of the modern era. Even Hollywood, which had once demonized him, acknowledged his magnetic allure, using his persona as a template for the Don figure in popular culture. But his legacy was not without contradiction. He was a man who valued loyalty above all, yet his own life was a study in betrayal, by rivals, allies, and even the country he once served. The United States had courted him during the war, utilized his underworld influence to secure Allied victories, and then discarded him to exile. Genovese had undermined him in New York. Batista had expelled him from Cuba. Luciano's story, therefore, is also a cautionary tale. Power is never permanent, and loyalty is often a fragile illusion. Psychologically, Luciano's life offers profound insight into ambition, strategy, and survival. He understood fear as a tool, charisma as a weapon, and patience as power. He survived assassination attempts, prison sentences, deportation, and exile, each trial refining his instincts and sharpening his mind. Even in Naples, stripped of authority, he continued to direct operations through letters, emissaries, and trusted confidants. He became a symbol of resilience, a master of influence who could command loyalty without a gun in hand. Yet, for all his brilliance, Luciano's life was shadowed by tragedy and irony. The man who had orchestrated empires, negotiated peace among rival gangs, and influenced international policy could not escape the human consequences of his choices. He spent his final years isolated, watched constantly by authorities, and haunted by the knowledge that the world he had built was moving on without him. Death, in a sense, liberated him from the cage he had created for himself, a kingdom of power that ultimately became a prison. Historians and criminologists continue to study Luciano's methods. He is often cited as the first modern organized crime CEO, a strategist whose influence extended far beyond the streets. His principles, hierarchy, codified rules, and calculated risk-taking, are now considered foundational to understanding both historical and contemporary criminal networks. In many ways, he anticipated globalization before it existed, linking continents, currencies, and conflicts with the precision of a master chess player. Yet, beyond the systems and money, it is his persona that endures. Lucky Luciano was both feared and admired, a paradoxical figure whose legend grew because of his contradictions. He was ruthless but disciplined, cunning but charismatic, a criminal who could negotiate peace and orchestrate war simultaneously. To understand the modern mafia, one must understand him, not merely as a gangster but as a man who reshaped the very concept of organized crime. For younger generations, the story of Lucky Luciano offers lessons in power, strategy, and consequence. It is a study in the dynamics of human ambition, how one individual can reshape institutions, influence nations, and leave a legacy that endures beyond death. But it is also a reminder that influence, however vast, is always temporary. The world moves on, empires fall, and legends remain, often in isolation, often misunderstood. Luciano's life, death, and myth continue to captivate historians, filmmakers, and crime enthusiasts alike. His story serves as a mirror to the duality of human ambition, the ability to create order from chaos, to command respect, and yet to be undone by the very forces that make success possible. As the camera pans over the skyline of modern New York, the narrator's voice, low and reflective, concludes, "Lucky Luciano built more than an empire of crime, he built a template for power itself." From the streets of Brooklyn to the casinos of Havana, from the docks of New York to the ports of Marseille, his influence is everywhere, woven into the very fabric of organized crime. But beyond power and money, beyond fame and fear, his true legacy is this: a reminder that the line between genius and infamy is razor-thin, and that history often remembers the architect more than the building itself. The scene fades to black, leaving only the echo of his name. Lucky Luciano, the Don who changed the world even from exile. Luciano's exile was more than a change of address, it was a profound psychological and emotional crucible. Removed from the streets he had ruled, separated from the city that had built him, and cut off from the immediate control of his empire, he was forced into a kind of introspection that few men of power ever experience. The years in Naples and the brief, electrifying period in Havana had stripped him of the immediacy of command, leaving him with his own thoughts, his memories, and the distant echo of influence. At first, exile felt like punishment, a slow, invisible confinement. In Naples, he wandered streets lined with the familiar hum of Italian life but devoid of the thrill of control. Cafés, ports, and neighborhoods passed by like theater sets, and he moved among them like a ghost. He could still give orders, still influence distant events, but the immediacy was gone. The men who answered him were intermediaries, the power was diluted. His empire continued, but in his absence, it had become a living thing, growing, shifting, and at times betraying him. Yet exile also brought clarity. Away from constant crises, he reflected on the architecture of his life, the rise, the betrayals, the triumphs, and the near misses. He understood, perhaps for the first time, the delicate balance of fear and loyalty that had allowed him to rule. He saw that the same structures that elevated him were the ones that could dismantle him. He wrote letters filled with observations, not commands, philosophizing about power as a force that must be respected, not owned. Havana had been a brief interlude of resurrection. There, among the neon lights and gambling tables, Luciano felt alive again. He could once more manipulate, charm, and negotiate. The city became his theater, the casino floors his boardroom. He had allies, wealth, influence, and the intoxicating illusion that he could rebuild. Yet even in the tropical sun, he felt the subtle tightening of constraints, the watchful eye of Batista, the whispers of the Americans, and the inevitability of political pressure that would one day end his reign there. By the time he returned to Naples, the philosophical weight of exile had deepened. He no longer acted impulsively. Decisions were measured, calibrated, and filtered through the lens of survival. He became contemplative, often silent in company, observing people, systems, and the world with an almost detached intensity. He spoke sparingly about the past, yet his conversations revealed a mind still calculating, still capable of strategy even without the direct means to implement it. Luciano's exile years were also marked by solitude. Friends and allies visited, letters carried updates from New York and Havana, but he lived increasingly within his own mind. The isolation allowed him to examine not just the mechanics of power, but the human cost. He pondered loyalty and betrayal, ambition and its consequences, control and its illusions. His health began to decline, and yet his intellect remained razor-sharp, focused more on observation than action. It was during this period that Luciano seemed to reconcile with his own myth. He had once been the public enemy, a target for law enforcement, a villain for the press, a danger to politicians. Now, in exile, he understood that myth itself was a tool of influence. He cultivated it subtly, allowing stories of his brilliance and ruthlessness to circulate while maintaining a low profile. He realized that power, once exercised, could endure even without his direct presence, that legend could outlive empire. Philosophically, exile reshaped his understanding of loyalty. He reflected on the betrayals he had suffered, by rivals, allies, and governments, and internalized a hard truth: in power there are no permanent friends, only temporary alliances. He advised younger mobsters accordingly, teaching that survival depended not on emotion, but on calculation, discretion, and foresight. Even as he aged, he continued to influence decisions across continents, though now through the subtle means of advice, letters, and observation rather than direct command. The exile years also revealed the limits of control. The world he had built continued without him, yet not always according to his plans. Havana's casinos fell under new pressures, narcotics routes shifted unpredictably, and Genovese consolidated power in New York. Exile taught him humility, that no empire, however meticulously constructed, could endure without the constant presence of its architect. It was a lesson in impermanence, in the ephemeral nature of influence, and in the inevitable arc of history. Yet paradoxically, exile also offered a form of liberation. Freed from the daily demands of leadership, the constant threat of bullets and betrayal, Luciano could reflect on his life as a whole. He examined the architecture of the mafia, the patterns of human behavior he had exploited, and the psychological levers of fear and loyalty he had mastered. In the stillness, he became both teacher and philosopher, observing the world from the shadows and understanding the forces that drive men to crime, ambition, and power. As the years passed, Luciano's exile became a kind of apprenticeship in mortality. He witnessed the rise of the next generation. Men who revered him, feared him, but also challenged the structures he had built. He realized that legacy was not about holding power, but about leaving ideas, systems, and strategies that could endure beyond one lifetime. In this way, his exile became a classroom and the world, a student of the man who had once ruled empires. In his final reflections, Luciano seemed to accept the duality of his existence: the man who had wielded absolute control, and the ghost who now watched it all from a distance. His exile years, filled with contemplation, observation, and subtle influence, were not the end of his story, but a quiet epilogue, a period in which he reconciled with the inevitability of aging, the fragility of power, and the enduring impact of his genius. The camera pans over the Bay of Naples, the sun setting in brilliant hues across the water. Luciano stands on his balcony, a solitary figure silhouetted against the sky, the city alive below but distant. The narrator's voice, calm and introspective, breaks the silence. Exile had taken him from the streets, from the casinos, and from the empire he built. Yet in the quiet of Naples, Lucky Luciano discovered a new kind of dominion, one over memory, influence, and understanding. He became a master not just of crime but of reflection, realizing that true power is not always in the hand that commands, but in the mind that observes, shapes, and endures. The scene fades slowly, leaving only the glimmer of the Mediterranean and the shadow of a man whose intellect and legacy would outlast even the empire he once ruled. Lucky Luciano's story did not end with his death, it transcended it. To understand his legacy is to understand the evolution of organized crime itself, the transformation from chaotic street gangs to highly structured, international networks. Luciano was not simply a gangster, he was a strategist, a visionary, and, in many ways, a revolutionary in the mechanics of criminal enterprise. His influence shaped not only the mafia, but the very psychology of power and organization in the underworld. The Commission, Luciano's crowning achievement, was more than a governing body. It was a system designed to balance ambition with control, greed with order. It became the blueprint for organized crime across the United States. Families that had once warred endlessly now had channels to negotiate disputes. Territories were allocated with precision. Executions, when they occurred, were not acts of chaos but strategic statements of authority. Through the Commission, Luciano turned crime into a form of governance, blending diplomacy with intimidation. Globally, his impact was equally profound. Luciano understood that criminal networks could no longer operate in isolation. Through strategic connections in Havana, Marseille, and Naples, he helped create routes for narcotics, gambling, and illicit finance that crossed oceans and borders. This globalization of organized crime was unprecedented. His fingerprints are visible in every major international trafficking route that emerged in the mid-20th century, and even modern law enforcement traces patterns that originated in his methods. Financially, Luciano pioneered the integration of legal and illegal economies. Casinos, hotels, and nightclubs were not just places of indulgence. They were sophisticated instruments of money laundering and influence. Luciano's partnership with Meyer Lansky in Havana exemplified this. Together, they transformed entertainment into enterprise, showing that control over both legitimate and illicit markets maximized power while minimizing risk. This duality, balancing legality with criminality, is now a hallmark of modern organized crime. Yet Luciano's legacy is not merely structural, it is deeply psychological. He taught generations of mobsters that control comes not from brute force alone, but from perception, reputation, and intellect. Fear was his tool, but so was respect. Loyalty was currency, betrayal a constant variable. By codifying the unwritten rules of the underworld, loyalty, secrecy, and hierarchy, he created an enduring culture of power that persists today. His life also illustrated the limits of power and the human cost of ambition. He rose higher than almost any criminal in history, yet he could not escape exile, aging, or betrayal. Genovese's quiet coup in New York, the American government's manipulation, and Batista's eventual expulsion from Havana all demonstrated that even the most brilliant strategist is vulnerable to forces beyond control. Luciano's story is a cautionary tale. Intelligence, foresight, and charisma can achieve empires, but they cannot fully guard against time, politics, or human frailty. Culturally, Luciano became a symbol, the archetypal Don. Films, books, and later television drew directly from his persona, the sophisticated, ruthless, and cunning mobster who combines charm with cold calculation. Even as the world demonized him, it also mythologized him. He became a reference point for what it means to command power in the shadows, to negotiate influence in both visible and invisible ways, and to turn criminality into an art form. Historians, criminologists, and sociologists continue to study Luciano not just for the crimes he committed, but for the system he created. His genius was operational and organizational, a fusion of psychology, logistics, and human management. The principles he established, hierarchy, accountability, strategic alliances, and risk management, remain relevant to anyone studying complex networks, whether in law enforcement, business, or politics. But perhaps the most compelling aspect of Luciano's legacy is the paradox he embodied. A man who sought control over all things, yet was ultimately subject to forces he could not govern. He was both master and prisoner, architect and ghost. His influence outlived him, yet he never fully escaped the weight of his own creation. The Mafia flourished after his death precisely because he had built it to endure, yet he himself could not witness its continued evolution. In New York, the families continued under the Commission, honoring the structural principles Luciano had set. In Italy, international connections blossomed, linking Sicilian, Neapolitan, and Corsican crime networks. In Havana and Miami, casinos thrived under models he had perfected, and narcotics routes he influenced became the backbone of post-war trafficking. Every corner of organized crime bore his fingerprints, a testament to his foresight, discipline, and ruthless intelligence. His psychological legacy endures as well. Luciano demonstrated that power is a blend of perception, calculation, and influence. Leadership requires more than fear or money, it requires understanding human behavior, predicting ambition, and manipulating perception. These lessons are timeless, extending beyond the underworld into political strategy, business leadership, and even social dynamics. As the narrator's voice echoes over visuals of New York, Havana, and Naples, the cities that shaped him and that he shaped in return, the audience is reminded of the duality that defined Lucky Luciano. He was a man of contradictions, a criminal who valued order, a king who faced exile, a master of chaos who sought structure. His empire survived him, but he never fully survived the empire. And yet, in every story, every legend, every whispered name, Lucky Luciano remains the architect of organized crime as we know it today. The camera lingers on archival images. Luciano in a sharp suit, meeting with Lansky walking Havana's casino floors, a shadowed figure in Naples. His life story, though filled with violence and betrayal, is also one of strategy, foresight, and intellect. The world remembers him not just for the crimes he committed, but for the empire he engineered and the principles he left behind. In the final moments, the screen fades to black with a single line. Lucky Luciano, the Don who turned crime into a system, power into strategy, and legend into immortality. This is the man whose methods shaped generations of organized crime, whose intellect redefined leadership in the shadows, and whose story continues to captivate, haunt, and instruct the world long after his death. Lucky Luciano's life was a study in contrasts, brilliance and brutality, loyalty and betrayal, empire and exile. From the tenements of Brooklyn to the casinos of Havana and the balconies of Naples, he reshaped the underworld, turning chaos into a structured empire. More than a gangster, he was a strategist, a visionary, and a master of influence, understanding human nature, fear, loyalty, and ambition better than anyone of his time. The commission he created became the blueprint for organized crime, balancing power, mediating disputes, and ensuring that empires outlasted individuals. His methods of combining legal and illegal enterprises, international networks, and strategic alliances redefined how criminal organizations operate even today. Yet Luciano's story is also a cautionary tale. Despite his genius, he could not escape exile, betrayal, or mortality. His empire survived, but he experienced the fragility of power firsthand. In his exile and death, he became a myth, a man whose intellect, ambition, and contradictions outlived him. Lucky Luciano remains immortal not just as a criminal, but as the architect of modern organized crime, a figure who turned strategy into legend and whose story continues to captivate, instruct, and warn generations about the limits of power and the price of ambition.